1,000 years ago, there was this prominent Islamic scholar.
Right, al-Bīrūnī.
Exactly. And he traveled all the way to South Asia, which, back then was a massive undertaking. He completely immersed himself in a totally foreign culture.
Oh, yeah.
And he actually mastered Sanskrit, which is an incredibly difficult language.
I mean, it's notoriously complex, yeah.
Right. And he did all this just to write this ethnographic masterpiece on Hinduism. And it was a study so generous and so stunningly objective and deeply curious about the religious other that modern anthropologists literally still use it as a model today.
It's just wild to think about.
It is. But then if you fast forward to like a typical Tuesday morning in 2026.
Yeah, quite a leap.
Right. You walk into an Islamic studies classroom in an American school, you crack open a textbook, and you find that it barely mentions other religions at all.
Or if it does, it's, not exactly flattering.
Exactly. When it finally does mention them, it is almost exclusively just to prove them wrong. The profound curiosity that al-Bīrūnī had, it's just gone.
Completely absent.
So the question we are tackling today is this. How did an intellectual tradition lose 1,000 years of its own history?
It's a heavy question.
It really is.
Okay.
So welcome to this deep dive. If you are joining us today, I am so glad you are here with us. Because whether you are a parent trying to raise grounded kids, or maybe an educator wrestling with curriculum, or just someone trying to navigate the incredibly diverse and sometimes totally chaotic American public square, the mystery we are looking at today is going to completely change how you view religious education.
It really shifts your entire perspective.
Totally. It changes how you see civic duty and that massive tension between holding deep convictions and embracing pluralism.
Right, and it is a tension we all face in one way or another, How do you remain deeply rooted in who you are while actively and, generously engaging with people who are fundamentally different? And as you pointed out with that incredible historical contrast, the way we answer that question today looks very different than it did a millennium ago.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to figure out exactly how U.S. Islamic schools are preparing their students for a radically diverse society. And we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of materials for this.
Well, we have some great sources today.
Yeah, we have an academic abstract, a super comprehensive conference presentation slide deck, and this deeply reflective, almost personal blog post.
And all of these are from the same researcher, right?
Yes, all of these come from Dr. Iqbal Akhtar. He presented this research at the ISLA, that's the Islamic Schools League of America Research Symposium, on April 26, 2026.
And Dr. Akhtar's background is, it's really essential context for the listener to keep in mind here.
Oh, for sure. Tell us about him.
Well, he is an associate professor of religious studies as well as politics and international relations at Florida International University. But beyond just his academic titles, he is the founding director of FIU's Jain Studies and Western Indian Ocean Studies programs.
Wow, Jain Studies too.
Yeah, and he's a co-founder of Miami Interfaith. So he is a scholar who truly lives and breathes the intersection of different religious traditions.
He's right in the middle of it.
Exactly. He isn't observing this tension from some distant ivory tower. I mean, he is in the thick of it every single day.
Which sets up our core mystery perfectly, I think. How did this ancient, breathtakingly curious intellectual tradition turn into a modern curriculum that seems to, kind of turn its back on the outside world?
That's quite a shift.
Yeah. Let's start with the reality on the ground right now. Just paint a picture for us. What does the landscape of Islamic education in the U.S. actually look like today?
Sure. So according to Dr. Akhtar's data, we are currently looking at over 300 full-time Islamic schools operating across the United States.
Over 300. That's a lot more than people might think.
Oh, absolutely. And that number represents a massive infrastructure. We are talking about tens of thousands of Muslim students walking through these doors every single day.
That is a highly significant footprint. I mean, we aren't just talking about a handful of weekend programs in church basements or something.
Yeah.
This is a sprawling national educational ecosystem.
Exactly. And we have to recognize the vital, necessary work these schools are doing.
Right.
They are providing moral and spiritual grounding in a world that, let's be honest, often feels entirely untethered.
Yeah, it really does.
They foster this profound sense of belonging, and they actively cultivate Islamic identity. And for a minority population, that is critical.
I actually want to push on that word minority for a second, because let's be real about the cultural water these kids are swimming in. It is not always a friendly environment out there.
Not at all. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the sociological scholarship on this.
Okay, lay it on us.
So Dr. Akhtar cites this philosopher, Michael S. Mary, writing back in 2007. And Mary analyzed the unique dual burden that's placed on minority religious schools.
Dual burden, meaning they had to do two very different things at once.
Yes. Mary points out that Muslim youth in America are growing up against a backdrop of societal misunderstanding, relentless media scrutiny, and, frankly, outright prejudice.
Yeah, that's undeniably true. So the school isn't just a place to, learn math and theology. It functions as a sanctuary.
Precisely. The school has a mandate to fortify a specific identity for these kids so they feel safe, so they feel grounded. They need to know who they are before they can face a world that often misrepresents them.
That makes total sense.
But here is the tension. At the exact same time they are doing this intense fortification work, they have an equally urgent mandate to prepare these kids for civic life.
And civic life in America means stepping into one of the most religiously diverse democracies in human history.
Exactly.
I mean, we aren't talking about some hypothetical scenario where these kids might meet someone of a different faith on vacation once.
No, it's everyday life.
When they graduate, they will go to massive state universities, right?
All right.
They will eventually vote on local and national policies. They will work in corporate offices. They will be neighbors.
Yes, to all kinds of people.
Exactly. They will raise their own children alongside Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and frankly, millions of people who are completely religiously unaffiliated.
That is the modern civic horizon. You simply cannot escape it. So the question that plagues these administrators is, how do you reconcile the fortification of a fragile minority identity with the necessary preparation for that overwhelming pluralistic reality?
Well, I have to ask, and I think you, the listener, might be wondering the exact same thing right now.
What's that?
If you are a school principal, right, and your primary overriding goal is to protect this fragile identity from a society that doesn't understand you, doesn't teaching your students about other religions feel totally counterproductive.
It feels like a risk, yeah.
Right. I mean, think of it this way. It's like spending all your time, your money, your energy fortifying the walls of a house. You're making them thicker and stronger to keep the elements out. But you completely forget to install any windows to see who your neighbors are.
That is exactly the psychological trap. It's a perfect analogy. Because if your entire operational paradigm is defense, then windows aren't features.
Right, they're weak points.
Exactly. They are vulnerabilities. They are literal gaps in your armor. If your job is to keep the cold wind out, why on earth would you open a window? You might think, if I show them the beautiful house across the street, they might leave this one.
Right. You're thinking, let's just keep the blinds drawn, lock the doors, and focus purely on what's inside. And honestly, it makes perfect logical sense from a defensive posture.
It makes complete sense, yes. But the irony, and this is what Dr. Akhtar's research brings forcefully to the surface, is that building a house with no windows is not actually how the House of Islamic Scholarship was originally designed.
It wasn't built that way.
No, not at all. The natural question that arises from this modern insular posture is whether this defensive crouch is a core feature of Islam itself, or if it is a completely modern invention.
And that brings us to what Dr. Akhtar calls the embarrassing paradox, which is such a striking phrase.
It really is.
In his blog post, he writes that it's embarrassing once you see it, because you can't unsee the discrepancy. He points out that the classical Islamic intellectual tradition produced some of the most generous, rigorous, and ethnographically curious works of comparative religion that human beings have ever written.
It is a stunning historical contrast, and it completely shatters the modern assumption that religious devotion somehow requires ignorance of other faiths.
Right. Let's look at the historical exemplars he provides, starting with the one you mentioned in the hook, Abu Rayyan al-Bīrūnī.
Let's really dig into al-Bīrūnī, because we are talking about the 11th century here, 973 to 1048 CE.
Yeah, so a long time ago.
Yes, and al-Bīrūnī was a total polymath. But the key thing is, he wasn't just sitting in a library in the Middle East reading secondhand accounts of other religions.
He wasn't just reading Wikipedia pages.
Right. He physically traveled to South Asia, he lived among Hindu communities, and most importantly, he took the time to actually learn Sanskrit.
I really want the listener to grasp the magnitude of that. Just think about the logistical and intellectual difficulty of a Muslim scholar moving to South Asia in the 11th century.
It's mind-boggling.
There are no modern translation tools, there's no internet, there's no Rosetta Stone. He's overcoming massive cultural barriers.
Yeah.
And he didn't just learn, like, a few conversational phrases to buy bread in the market. He mastered a highly complex, sacred language so he could read their texts in the original.
And the result of all that effort was his book, Takma Lilhind. And you have to understand, this was not a polemic.
Right, it wasn't an attack.
Exactly. It wasn't some hit piece designed to make Hinduism look bad and Islam look good. It was a model of cross-cultural ethnographic inquiry.
Wow.
Dr. Akhtar notes that its patient interior accuracy is so profound that modern scholars today still rely on it. Al-Bīrūnī genuinely wanted to understand Hinduism on its own terms.
It's like he was conducting modern, peer-reviewed anthropology a millennia before the discipline was even formally invented.
Pretty much.
And he isn't an isolated genius either. I mean, Dr. Akhtar also brings up al-Shahrastani, who lived shortly after, from 1086 to 1153 CE.
Yes, al-Shahrastani is another great example. He compiled this massive work called Al-Milal wa al-Niyol.
What is that exactly?
It was an encyclopedic survey of religious communities and philosophical schools, and it was so incredibly comprehensive and detailed that modern historians of religion are still studying it, and they're still arguing with its categorizations today.
Here is my question, though. Why were they doing this?
What do you mean?
Like, were they just secular academics who happen to be Muslim? Because today, we often associate that kind of objective comparative study with secular universities, not really with deeply religious environments.
And that is the core misconception Dr. Akhtar is trying to dismantle right there. They were not doing this in spite of their faith. They were doing it because of their faith.
Ooh, really?
Yes. This intellectual curiosity was rooted directly in their scriptural foundation. The Quran itself, specifically verse 49.13, mandates a concept called ta'aruf.
Ta'aruf. Okay, what does that actually mean in practice?
It translates roughly to mutual recognition across human difference. The Quran explicitly states that God created humanity in different nations and tribes specifically so that they might come to know one another.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it is framed not as some sociological accident, but as a divine mandate for pluralism. The diversity of the human race isn't a mistake that needs to be corrected. It is the intent of the Creator.
That completely flips the script.
It really does.
So the diversity is the point. It's not a test of your faith to see if you can ignore the neighbors. It's a literal command to engage with them.
Exactly. Furthermore, the Quran teaches the concept of universal prophecy.
Which is what?
It's the idea that God sent messengers to every single people on earth. Therefore, it doesn't view other religious traditions as complete, dark voids of truth. It specifically addresses Christians and Jews as al-Kitab, which translates to the people of the book.
Right.
They are viewed as partners in a historical, covenantal relationship.
And it wasn't just theoretical theology happening in a vacuum, right? There was a very real, very tangible political precedent for this kind of pluralism right at the inception of the community. Dr. Akhtar points to the Uthafet al-Medina, the Medinan Covenant of 622 CE.
Yes, and this is a crucial piece of the puzzle. The Medinan Covenant was established by the Prophet Muhammad himself. It was a formal framework for pluralistic governance.
So it was a political document?
Yes, and it explicitly recognized the rights, the duties, and the religious autonomy of non-Muslim communities, specifically Jewish tribes, who were living within the same political body as the early Muslims.
This is the critical takeaway for our listener to understand here. These historical examples, al-Bīrūnī's deep ethnography, al-Shahrastani's massive encyclopedia, the Medinan Covenant's political framework, these were not concessions.
They were absolutely not concessions. They were not watering down their faith to appease some secular power. They were expressions of supremely confident Muslim scholarship.
I love that phrase, supremely confident.
It's true. Al-Bīrūnī didn't feel his Islamic identity threatened by learning Sanskrit. His worldview literally demanded a rigorous, curious engagement with the diverse world God created.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If this deep, profound curiosity, this mandate for mutual recognition, is literally baked into the DNA of the religion, how did it go so entirely quiet in American classrooms?
It's the big question.
I mean, you don't just misplace an encyclopedic tradition of comparative religion like you misplace your car keys. How do you lose 1,000 years of intellectual heritage?
Well, you don't lose it overnight. It is a slow, profound, institutional shift driven by context. And to answer how this heritage was lost, we have to move away from the history books for a minute.
Okay, where do we look?
We have to look at the ground reality of how these subjects are actually being taught today. And this brings us directly to the core of Dr. Akhtar's research design, because he wanted to scientifically measure the gap between that brilliant historical heritage and the modern classroom.
Let's break down how he actually did this, because the methodology here is vital.
It really is.
If I'm a parent listening to this, I want to know this isn't just one guy's opinion. He didn't just send out a quick SurveyMonkey link to a few friends. This was a qualitative, multi-method study. He spent time investigating 12 different Islamic schools across 5 U.S. metropolitan regions.
And the variation in his sample is what gives the study its real weight.
Right. He didn't just look at one type of school.
Exactly. He looked at full-time schools and he looked at weekend programs. He captured schools across different sectarian orientations within Islam and across completely different geographic contexts.
Why is that so important?
Because he needed to see if this loss of curiosity was just a localized issue, say just a problem in one specific city, or if it was a field-wide pattern.
That makes sense. And he utilized 3 intersecting tracks for his research to figure this out. Track 1 was a content analysis of widely used textbooks and curricular materials. He is literally reading the books the kids are assigned.
Yeah.
Track 2 was conducting 24 semi-structured interviews with the actual educators, the teachers, and the curriculum coordinators. And track 3, this is where it gets really interesting to me, was direct classroom observation. He literally sat in the rooms and watched the teaching happen.
The value of this specific research design, this triangulation, cannot be overstated.
Triangulation, you mean getting data from 3 different angles?
Right. By looking at the textbooks, talking to the teachers behind closed doors, and watching the actual teaching in real time, the study separates what schools claim to do with their glossy mission statements from what is actually happening when the bell rings.
Now, he does offer a caveat in his presentation, which we should mention. He notes that this study is exploratory. 12 schools is not nationally representative in a strict statistical quantitative sense.
Sure.
But the patterns he found are what he calls field level. They are remarkably consistent across all those sectarian and regional lines.
And that's key. When you see the exact same pedagogical gap in a full-time, well-funded school on the East Coast and a volunteer-run weekend school in the Midwest, you know you are looking at a systemic reality. It's not an isolated quirk. The system itself is producing this outcome.
I want you, the listener, to pause for a second. Imagine being a fly on the wall in one of those 12 schools.
Okay.
You are sitting in the back row of an Islamic studies class. You're a high schooler. When the topic of another religion naturally comes up, because again, you live in America, it has to come up, what are these textbooks actually telling the students?
Well, this leads us to the first major and honestly quite sobering finding from Dr. Akhtar's content analysis track.
What did he find?
He identifies what he terms the comparative deficit.
The comparative deficit. Break that down for us. What are we actually seeing on the pages of these textbooks?
We are seeing a profound absence. Dr. Akhtar points out that very often, other religious traditions simply do not appear at all.
They just aren't there.
Right. But when they do appear, they are framed almost exclusively as foils for Islamic truth claims.
So they're just props to make the home team look better.
Precisely. Christianity and Judaism, for example, are introduced mainly through their alleged corruptions, their theological deficiencies, and their cautionary value.
Wow.
Yeah. The textbooks do not treat them as living, breathing traditions with their own internal coherence and sincere communities of believers. They exist in the text only to demonstrate why Islam is the corrective.
Dr. Akhtar sums this up in his blog post with a devastating line. He writes that it was a sentence he almost cut from his presentation because it felt so heavy, but he realized he had to leave it in because it was a factual finding.
What's the line?
He said, "Our curricula are, in a real sense, less Quranic than the Quran."
Let that sink in. The holy text itself offers a more generous, complex, and relational view of other faiths than the modern textbooks designed to teach that very religion to children.
It's wild.
As Akhtar bluntly puts it, there is absolutely no al-Bīrūnī in these curricula. The ethnographic curiosity is dead on arrival.
It's staggering. I'm trying to think of an analogy for how limiting this is.
Oh, analogies are great here.
Like, imagine you are trying to understand a rival sports team. You really want to know how they play, what their strategy is, how their offense works.
Sure.
But the only tape you are legally allowed to watch is a highly edited compilation of their absolute worst bloopers, their fumbles, their missed shots, and their penalties.
Right, a low-light reel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You would walk away thinking they are totally incompetent, but you would never actually learn how they play the game. You would be totally unprepared to actually face them on the field or understand why millions of people are fans of that team.
That is a fantastic analogy because it highlights the intentional curation of the negative. What's fascinating here is the academic term Dr. Akhtar uses to describe this textbook phenomenon. He calls it a heresiographical lens.
Heresiographical. Okay, let's define that for the listener.
Well, heresiography is the study of or the writing about heresies. When you apply a heresiographical lens to another group, you are analyzing them only to prove why they are wrong.
You're not looking for the good stuff.
No, not at all. You are sorting truth from falsehood, but the result is completely predetermined before you even start the inquiry. You aren't asking what do they believe and why does it bring them meaning? You are asking, how can I quickly demonstrate that their belief is flawed?
So if a textbook, using a heresiographical lens, brings up the Christian concept of the Trinity, for instance,
Right.
it's not going to spend time explaining the deep mystery and historical development of Trinitarian theology. It's just going to immediately present it as a mathematical error to be debunked.
Exactly. It's entirely defensive. It's an intellectual closed circuit. And you have to contrast this with the empathetic, covenantal approaches modeled by those early scholars we talked about.
Right, al-Bīrūnī.
Yes. Al-Bīrūnī didn't use a heresiographical lens. He used an ethnographic one. He wanted to understand the interior logic of the Hindu community. The modern textbooks have basically abandoned the ethnographic for the heresiographical.
So naturally, this begs a massive question. If the books are this restrictive, this defensive, who is to blame?
That's where people's minds go immediately.
Because as a parent or an outside observer, it's really easy to jump to conclusions. You might assume that there's some ideological conspiracy by the educators. You might think, oh, these administrators are deliberately trying to brainwash kids to hate other religions.
Right, you assume malicious intent.
But the interview track of Dr. Akhtar's research, when he actually sat down behind closed doors and talked to these 24 educators, reveals a surprisingly human and, frankly, deeply sympathetic answer.
Yes, the narrative completely shifts when we move from analyzing the texts to talking to the actual teachers. It's not about malice or a grand conspiracy of intolerance. It's about what Dr. Akhtar calls the pedagogical default.
Let's talk about the psychology of the teachers here. In these interviews, they were remarkably honest, weren't they?
They really were. They confess that they feel entirely underprepared, both theologically and pedagogically, to facilitate interfaith discussions in the classroom.
They just don't know how.
No, they want to do a good job, but they feel like they are flying blind.
They explicitly named 4 major obstacles that they face every single day. Let's walk through them.
Sure.
First, a total lack of training. They simply haven't been taught how to teach comparative religion. Second, a lack of age-appropriate resources. I mean, even if a teacher wanted to explain Buddhism to an 8th grader, they don't have the materials to do it fairly.
There's no good book to hand them.
Right. Third, a lack of institutional encouragement. The administration isn't pushing them to explore these topics. It's not on the standardized tests, you know.
And the fourth obstacle is the one that really drives the behavior, I think.
What's that?
They expressed an intense, palpable fear of pushback from parents and administrators. Yes. They are terrified that if they spend substantive time discussing Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism, they will be perceived as elevating other religions alongside Islam, or somehow watering down the faith.
Just paint that picture for us. How does that fear actually manifest in a classroom setting?
Imagine you are a 6th grade Islamic studies teacher.
Okay.
You are in the middle of a lesson, and a student raises their hand and asks an innocent question about their Hindu neighbor's Diwali celebration. They just want to know what it means and how a Muslim should view it.
Very common question.
If you don't have the training, the resources, or the institutional backing, that question isn't an educational opportunity. It is a trap.
Wow, a trap.
Yeah. If you answer it too generously, a student goes home, tells their parents you're promoting Hinduism, and you get an angry email, or worse, you get called into the principal's office.
You panic. And what happens when you panic? You default to safety. The consequence of all this fear is the pedagogical default. The teachers rely on rote memorization and doctrinal recitation. Just read the page, memorize the verse, and let's move on, because that is the only place they feel safe and confident.
It's an omission born of fear. Dr. Akhtar points out that this aligns perfectly with broader systemic gaps in U.S. Islamic teacher education.
Who else talks about this?
He cites scholars like Nadim Memon from 2011 and Claire Al-Kawatli from 2018, who have extensively documented how under-resourced teacher training is in this specific sector. The tragic reality is that the analytical engagement with religious diversity doesn't fall out of the curriculum because of some malicious ideological design.
Right.
It falls out simply because nobody in the room feels equipped to handle the conversation.
Wait, I have to challenge this expectation we put on educators, though.
Okay, go ahead.
If I am an underpaid, overworked teacher and I am terrified of getting angry emails from parents, isn't sticking to rote memorization just a basic survival tactic? How can we possibly expect these teachers to be the bold vanguards of pluralism if we don't give them a safety net? It feels completely unfair.
Oh, it is unfair. You cannot place the burden of repairing a 1,000-year intellectual gap on the shoulders of a 6th-grade teacher who doesn't even have a decent textbook.
Exactly.
But recognizing this is actually the good news in Dr. Akhtar's findings.
Good news. How so?
Because a problem of resources, training, and formation is a solvable problem. If the educators were driven by deep-seated ideological hatred, that would be incredibly difficult to uproot. But a lack of training, a fear of parents, we know how to fix those structural issues.
Ah, I see. But fixing it requires more than just, like, a new syllabus.
Yes, much more.
It requires a massive shift in perspective. It requires a fundamental paradigm shift in how these schools, the administrators, and most importantly the parents, view pluralism itself. Which leads us to the pivot point of Dr. Akhtar's entire argument. Pluralism has to be seen as a recovery, not a concession.
This is the absolute core of his message, and as he warns in his presentation, it is the most easily misheard part of his research, so we must be very clear.
Let's lay it out.
Integrating interfaith literacy into Islamic education is not a dilution of Islamic identity. It is not an attempt to appease a secular, liberal, American version of pluralism.
That is such a key distinction, because I think a lot of conservative religious communities, and this is true whether they're Muslim, Christian, or Orthodox Jewish, they hear the word pluralism or interfaith, and their defenses immediately go up.
Right, they see a threat.
They think, oh, they want us to water down our beliefs so we can all hold hands and sing songs. They want us to say all paths are exactly the same and theology doesn't matter.
Exactly. They view pluralism as a secular imposition from the outside, a threat to their distinctiveness. But Dr. Akhtar argues the exact opposite. He says this is a recovery of an authentically Islamic intellectual tradition.
You aren't importing a Western secular concept.
No, you are dusting off a classical Islamic one.
He introduces this framework called covenantal pluralism, which he wrote about in the Journal of Interreligious Studies in 2024. And this is where his unique background becomes so rich.
Yes, his Jain studies background really comes in here.
Right. He draws on the Hebrew concept of Brit, which means covenant. He draws on the Medinan Mitak, the early Islamic covenant we discussed. And he synthesizes this with a profound Jain epistemology called Anekantavada.
Let's really unpack Anekantavada for a moment because it provides the philosophical scaffolding for this recovery.
Go for it.
It is a core Jain concept that literally translates to many-sidedness. It is the idea that ultimate truth and reality are infinitely complex and have multiple aspects.
So no one has the whole picture.
Exactly. Therefore, no single specific human perspective can capture the absolute totality of truth.
I think the classic analogy here is the blind man and the elephant, right?
That is the perfect analogy. Several blind men touch an elephant to learn what it is like. One touches the trunk and says, it's like a snake.
Right.
Another touches the leg and says, it's like a tree trunk. Another touches the side and says, it's like a wall. None of them are entirely wrong, but none of them possess the total truth of the elephant.
They all have a piece of it.
Yes. Anekantavada requires the humility to recognize that other perspectives hold fragments of the reality you're seeking.
So Dr. Akhtar is pulling from his expertise in Jain studies, Jewish dialogue, and Islamic history to build this framework. But he insists the covenantal grammar, the capacity for this kind of many-sidedness, is already inside the Islamic tradition.
It's already there.
The schools don't need to reinvent the wheel or borrow from secular sociology. The work is merely to remember what was forgotten.
This raises an important question about the psychology of religious education itself. When you design a curriculum from a place of fear of the secular world, fear of the Christian majority, fear of losing identity, you inevitably create brittle identities in your students.
Brittle. That's a good word for it.
A fortress might seem strong, but if the walls are rigid enough, They shatter when struck by an unexpected force.
But when you teach from a place of historical confidence, like al-Bīrūnī learning Sanskrit without a shred of fear that he'd lose his soul, you create something entirely different.
You create resilient, deeply rooted students.
Yes, they can step out of the fortress, walk into a diverse public square, and engage the religious other without feeling threatened.
It completely changes their posture in the world.
So what does this all mean for the schools today? It means realizing that embracing pluralism isn't about becoming more Western. It's about becoming more historically Islamic.
That is the paradigm shift that unlocks everything else. Once the educators and the parents grasp that, the fear begins to dissipate. Pluralism stops being a secular threat and becomes a religious obligation.
Okay, theory is great. The historical philosophy of the Mennonite Covenant is beautiful. But I want to push back on the logistics here.
Okay, let's get practical.
How does a school actually implement this on a random Tuesday morning in November? We have to get practical. Dr. Akhtar proposes 3 specific pathways forward for the field.
Yes, he moves from the theoretical to the highly actionable. The first pathway, and he argues this is the highest leverage intervention available, is teacher formation.
Which makes total sense based on what we just uncovered. If the teachers are terrified of parental backlash, nothing changes.
Exactly. This means targeted professional development specifically for Islamic studies, teachers in the areas of comparative religion, and facilitated dialogue pedagogy.
So actually teaching the teachers how to teach this stuff.
Yeah. Yes. As Akhtar bluntly puts it, teachers cannot teach what they do not know. We have to invest in the educators first. We have to give them the theological grounding to know that it is okay to teach this, and the pedagogical tools to manage complex, sensitive conversations in the classroom without panicking.
Pathway number 2 is curricular resources. Because you can't just train the teachers and then send them back to the classroom with the exact same hagiographical textbooks, right?
That would defeat the purpose.
Right. Dr. Akhtar calls for developing textbook supplements that are grounded in Islamic sources. He points right back to the classical Malal Wanyal genre we discussed earlier. He says, we do not need to invent a method, we need to remember one. These resources need to engage other traditions with theological generosity.
And then we come to the third pathway, which is perhaps the most transformative, but also the most challenging.
Yeah, what's that?
Lived partnerships.
Yeah.
This is about establishing sustained pedagogical relationships with neighboring religious communities. We are talking about partnerships with local synagogues, churches, Hindu temples, and Sikh gurdwaras.
Now, I have to challenge this.
Why?
If I'm a teacher who is already afraid of getting angry emails just for mentioning Judaism in a lecture, actually bringing my students to a synagogue feels like career suicide. How does Dr. Akhtar expect them to bridge that gap in reality?
Well, he's very careful to distinguish this from what he calls performative interfaith gestures.
We all know what those look like, right? The photo op where leaders from different faiths stand together, smile for the camera, maybe plant a tree, and then never speak to each other again.
Right. That performative model is not what he is advocating for at all. To address your point about the teacher's fear, this is why the paradigm shift must happen at the administrative and parental level first. The school board has to sanction this.
Oh, so the teacher isn't acting alone.
Exactly. And when they do, Dr. Akhtar references the work of Eboo Patel, specifically his 2016 book, Interfaith Leadership. Dr. Akhtar is calling for slow, respectful engagement across differences that is actually built into the rhythm of the school year.
So it's not just a one-off field trip on a Thursday, it's an ongoing relationship.
Exactly. Patel's model emphasizes that pluralism is a muscle.
A muscle.
Yes. You only learn it, you only build it by actually being in the room with people who are fundamentally different from you and navigating that space together. The students need to experience the lived reality of another community.
I want to address you, the listener, directly for a second. Think about your own education, regardless of your religious or cultural background.
Yeah, reflect on it.
Did you learn the most about other cultures or other belief systems from reading a dry, defensive paragraph in a textbook? Or did you learn it from actually sitting next to someone, from sharing a meal with them, working on a community service project together, or just really listening to their story?
The lived experience is where the empathy actually forms.
Exactly. That lived experience is the modern equivalent of what al-Bīrūnī was doing 1,000 years ago. He didn't just read a scroll about Hinduism, he went and lives with the community.
And these schools have the opportunity to recreate that ethnographic curiosity for their students right in their own neighborhoods.
It has been an incredible journey unpacking this. We started with the classical Golden Age scholars like al-Bīrūnī and al-Sharastani modeling supreme intellectual confidence.
Truly a golden age of curiosity.
Then we moved through the modern reality of fearful, insular classrooms, the comparative deficit, the heresiographical lens. But we are ending on a genuinely hopeful note.
We really are.
The educators Dr. Akhtar interviewed aren't resistant to this change. They are hungry for it.
They want to do the right thing for their students. They just need the permission, the training, and the resources to do it. As Dr. Akhtar concludes in his blog, the heritage is theirs. The classrooms are theirs. The work is theirs to reclaim.
And we need to remember the broader civic implication here, too. This isn't just an internal theological debate for Islamic schools.
No, it affects everyone.
Right. The tens of thousands of young Muslims graduating from these institutions are stepping out into an American public square that is highly polarized, fearful, and often totally fractured. Islam, at its historical best, offers that public square a beautiful vision of human dignity grounded in divine intent.
It's a vision we really need.
The United States desperately needs the working philosophy of religious co-citizenship that was modeled in the Medellin Covenant all those centuries ago.
The health of a diverse democracy relies entirely on citizens who are deeply rooted in their own convictions, yet entirely capable of extending grace, curiosity, and respect to their neighbors.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought.
Okay, let's hear it.
We've spent this time exploring how a return to ancient roots, the covenantal grammar of early Islam, is actually the key to modern pluralism for these specific schools. But let's extrapolate that out.
Okay.
What if we applied Dr. Akhtar's concept of covenantal pluralism and that Jain idea of anekantavada, that reality is perceived differently from diverse points of view to everyone?
It's a very compelling thought experiment.
What would happen if every religious and secular institution in America stopped building defensive walls? What if every church, every synagogue, every secular university dug deep into their own ancient texts, their own founding documents, to find their own hidden mandates for mutual recognition?
That would change the country.
Could the cure for our modern, hyper-polarized, fearful society actually be hiding right there in the dusty, forgotten pages of our oldest traditions? Maybe the way forward isn't inventing something new, but finally remembering what we already knew a long time ago.
That is something worth pondering deeply.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking for those hidden mandates, and keep seeking out multiple perspectives. Take care.